Welcome to our program on race and identity in the Jewish community, hosted by B'nai B'rith International and the B'nai B'rith Connect Young Leaders Division. I'm Eric Fusfield, Deputy Director of the B'nai B'rith International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy, also Director of Legislative Affairs. In the wake of tragedies such as this Sunday's police shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, 2020 has witnessed a wave of protests for racial justice, including the upcoming March on Washington, which is scheduled to coincide with the August 28th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. These gatherings have propelled social equity issues to the forefront of the public agenda, even as a global pandemic and an economic recession have taken hold during a presidential election year. B'nai B'rith, with its long history of engagement in civil rights, represents a Jewish community that has recommitted itself to promoting racial equality as the often polarized public debate over racial discrimination has taken center stage. What may not have been initially obvious to some is the important role that Jews of color can play in this public discussion. I say not obvious because many people in our community are simply unaware of the rapidly growing number of American Jews who co-identify as Black, Hispanic, Asian American, or Native American, as well as Jews of Middle Eastern or Ethiopian descent who may also regard themselves as persons of color. Studies have placed the percentage of Jews of color at somewhere between 6 and 14% of American Jewry. In other words, if you were to join a different prayer minyan each day, it's a statistical likelihood that every other day those groups would include at least one, perhaps several Jews of color. What does this demographic shift promise for the future of our community as we come to resemble more closely the broader American society? How will it impact the internal dynamics of our community as well as our community's activism and engagement? Here to discuss these and other questions are two Jewish community leaders who have established themselves as prominent voices on race and identity in the Jewish world. Both of them have assumed new positions in just the past few months. Stacey Aviva Flint moved just this month from her home in Illinois to Boulder, Colorado, where she is now executive director of Congregation Bonai Shalom, a conservative synagogue. A noted authority on Jewish and African American relations, she's a former outreach and engagement coordinator at a congregation in the Chicago area and is a frequent author of blog and op-ed articles. Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein is a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at the Jewish Federations of North America. A modern Orthodox rabbi and accomplished musician, he previously served as rabbi in residence at Hazon, a Jewish environmental organization, as well as a congregational leader in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan. Stacey and Isaiah, I think we can use first names here. Welcome. It's a pleasure to speak with both of you today on some timely issues where your voices are greatly valued. Diversity is one of our country's strong suits. I wanted to start by asking you about the growing racial diversity within our community, reflected in the numbers I cited a moment ago. We've always been a multifaceted community, one that includes Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Mizrahim, and Jews of different religious and cultural practices. But what is the likely impact of growing racial diversity on the Jewish community in the near term and the future? What opportunities and challenges are present here? Whoever would like to take that one up first. Stacey, would you like to kick it off?
you so much. First of all, I just want to say to B'nai B'rith that what you're doing today is exactly what the Jewish community should be doing, is letting Jews of color speak for themselves on these important topics. So thank you, B'nai B'rith, for stepping up to the conversation and stepping out of the way. This is called leadership, and I appreciate that. I think the opportunity that we have is to really change the narrative about the Jewish community. What is said about us, but what we are saying about ourselves. And most importantly, what we are saying about ourselves to the next generation. And I think that that's where it's most powerful, is helping our children and our young people understand who we are as a community and as a Jewish community. When someone encounters a Jew who does not look like them, it should not be a surprise. It should be, if anything, oh my goodness, I have been waiting to meet my brothers and sisters that I've heard about. I just haven't had the opportunity to meet. Every Jewish child knows about Anne Frank, Eli Wiesel, the Rebbe, Golda Meir. They should also have learned about Billy Simons, who was a South Carolina Jew from the 1850s, Julius Lester of blessed memory, who was an academic and a writer, Yavila McCoy, our modern day sister, Anthony Mordecai Zevi Russell, a Yiddish cantor, Aviva Baskin, and much more. These should be a regular part of our religious schools and our Hebrew school learnings, so that when our Jewish students are engaged in these conversations, they're not engaging with people in situations that they've never encountered before. We hope that one day it will be so natural that they're immersed in the diversity of our community, and they're even able to say, you know what? Our community has struggled with racism, and we are still struggling with it and working out ways to overcome it, so that we're not engaging in the conversation timidly or fearfully, like, oh my goodness, what do we do? We can be open and transparent and go, you know what? We struggled for a while because it was all Ashkenormative. It was all like, Jews are one people, but we realized we weren't. We went about actively making sure that we knew our own story, and we told our story widely and broadly. And so we can be proud of our diversity, and that our young people can really actively be involved in these conversations with confidence.
Excellent. It's a work in progress, isn't it? And we need to be part of that work. And thank you. I was wondering at what point in the discussion the word Ashkenormative would surface. And my wife is Mizrahi, so I'm familiar with that term. But so thanks for breaking the bubble on that one. Isaiah.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to say again also that I'm grateful to be here with both of you, and really with everyone else who might be tuning in. I'll just really carry off of what Stacey shared. I really feel like from my perspective, my entire life has been charged by race. I've been alive. I'm 31 years old. My parents have been married for 40 years. Before the term Jews of color existed, my parents were an interracial couple living in Muncie, New York. And in many ways, one of the descriptors from the Torah that I have carried with me is the line from Moses, from Moshe, when he says, Ki garayiti be'eretz nachriya, when he was naming his son Gershom, I was a stranger there. He was really describing in many ways, I think, the Jewish community, how throughout history we've been strangers in strange lands. But what happens when you feel like a stranger within your strange community? What happens when you're a minority within the minority? And I think for me, a lot of my life and in my activism and what I care about is engaging in those slow steps and sometimes we need to be a little bit more, I think, fierce and forward thinking, but engaging in those steps to expose people to the narratives of our Jewish community. The fact that we're not just how, the Jewish community, we're not a monolith, right? The Black community is not a monolith also. And we come from different backgrounds and experiences. And I think one of the opportunities that I would like to think of and provide, at least to suggest, even as we engage in this high holiday season, right? One of the things that I realized as I was growing up, and it specifically hit me pretty hard when I was working in a synagogue, and I was with my entire family who I invited, and we were walking home from synagogue together. And I was like, wait, I haven't really walked home from synagogue before with my entire family. Not only did I realize growing up that I felt different when being somewhere with my father and my mother, just because of how I was socialized in my community of around race, I also it dawned on me that my family wasn't showing up to shul. Members of my family wasn't going to synagogue. And I think just to Stacey's point about making sure that it would be normal to see myself in the community. And when we talk about data, Eric, you were mentioning, right? 1 out of those 6 days at least, or whatever it might mean, where are people going? And I think a question that I'll pause with is, if, as a rabbi, I think about for myself, or the opportunities that I think all of our institutions and our communities have is, when people are showing up, what are people seeing that actually helps them reflect on their own selfhood, right? When making announcements from the pulpit, what community efforts are announced? When giving speeches or addresses, who's being spoken about? What's being spoken about? So my question for me is, how do we create communities and organizations that really Jews of color, people of color in the Jewish community, mixed race, multiracial, whatever the term might be that we use, can see themselves in? And yes, we could be fierce, we could take big, strong stances, but I would also encourage not necessarily in flashy or big ways, but actually right in the details, the subtle, measurable and specific things that we might be able to think about, so that we're being authentic, specifically to build narratives that include the many different diverse stories that we all bring to the Jewish community.
That's interesting. I think you're both painting a picture of ways in which we can better understand these dynamics in our community, in ways that we can. I hate to use the word reimagine, because I think it's overused in our political dialogue nowadays. But other ways to envision our community, both from within and the way we present ourselves to the world. But I want to probe a little bit deeper here on otherization, because I'm getting the sense, but I want to not surmise, I want to hear it from you if this is true, that look, in almost any context, minorities are made to feel otherized. In other words, not an intrinsic part of the group to which they belong. We probably have people in American society who feel this way. I'm American, but am I fully accepted here? So I just want to get a sense of to what extent Jews of color are made to feel otherized in the community today, and what can we all learn from these experiences to make our community more inclusive?
I'd like to speak on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I think that something that really resonates with me, my kids they're older now, but I remember The Lion King. And I remember the line where the little monkey Rafiki is talking to Simba, and he says, "Remember who you are."
Yeah.
Because Simba had gone out and he tried to run away from who he was. He was supposed to be the next king, and he was running away from that. And so I think that we have to remember who we are. And when we otherize, or I would even say make invisible, Jews of color, we're forgetting who we are historically as a Jewish community. We have been historically and purposefully, I believe, multicultural. And so the presence of Jews of color in a Jewish synagogue or institution should not be a surprise. A Jewish child should not gasp at a Black or brown classmate or a synagogue visitor. And they shouldn't be directed to the kitchen or assumed to be the help, or that all Jews are white. So I have some examples. My daughter went to a JCC camp for many years, and my daughter has very fair skin. but very curly hair. And she reported to me when she got back from camp that the students, her other campers said to her, you know what, you would really look white if you straightened your hair. And when my son went to Hebrew school, he related to me, not immediately, but sometime after, when he kind of got comfortable kind of telling me his experiences, that he was asked if he was going to steal something, or at camp if he was from Africa or from the inner city. And when I heard these stories, yes, I was sad. I wasn't so much sad for my children, because I know that my children are strong and they know who they are. I was sad for the other children, because what an opportunity they had missed to really understand who the members of their families were and are. And I think right now, during the time of COVID, when our synagogue doors are closed, and though we would want to be there, we can't, this is the time to dig deep, to learn and to teach, so that when we do reopen, our houses of prayer are for everyone, and that we expect every type of Jew to walk in that door. And I'll just say one final thing. Sometimes our children of color in our Jewish communities are so loved and they're so protected, and they're in a little bubble because everyone knows them at their shul. And then when they step out of that bubble and they go to college and they go away somewhere else, that's when they realize, wait a minute, something's amiss. Everyone loved me, everyone knew me, and now I'm in a situation where I'm being questioned on my Jewishness. And so every Jewish child, white, Black, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, should expect someone of a different heritage to encounter them, so that when they go to college and they step outside of that bubble, they're not surprised and offending someone, and they're not feeling like, wait a minute, was I just uh, protected all of my life, or things were misrepresented? This is not how the Jewish community really is. It should be the same whether my child goes from Colorado to Illinois to Tennessee. The Jewish community should be so rich and deep that those bubbles don't exist. But that if we could start breaking down those bubbles and have it be normal. And I hope that when our synagogue doors do reopen, we all want them to reopen, that we will have a freshness and a newness about us on this area, very area of race.
Excellent. Well, you said a number of things there that we could go on for a couple hours about, but I want to hear from Isaiah.
Yes, I'll just add on the note of othering. I think many of these conversations, and specifically conversations around race and identity and Jewish identity, it's about perspective, right? It's about the glasses that we're wearing. And so when it comes to this word of otherizing, or I'll just say that, going back to Moses, right? Moses, when he goes before Pharaoh, he says, Elokei Ivrim Shalachni, right? The God of the others. Who's seen as the others is really based on your perspective. Right. And I think that so much of this work also is understanding that we're always going to have our biases. We come with a lens. And if you use Freud as the imprint that we have, we come with a voice, we come with perspectives. Now, the issue is not necessarily having bias. And it's also, not necessarily having prejudice. I think that, yes, we need to unlearn some of the ways in which we approach and look at others. But in many ways, it's what do we do with that? How are we carrying out what discrimination is when we are acting because of our biases in a certain way. Now, it's true, we need to start, or racism is acting because of this fake racial construct around saying that some people are more inferior or less inferior based on the color of their skin, right? It's actually, this idea of othering, to me, it's actually peeling away the layers and approaching it slightly through a lens of psychology. As a social worker, I would say that. And I think that, this idea of how do we approach othering in the Jewish community, or how are we looking at our Jewish life today, as Stacey shared in her thoughts about understanding the rich tapestry of Jewish life, right? We are stronger because we're together. We are 12 tribes, let's say. We are a group of people that it's beautiful that we have so much texture. The question is, how do we actually celebrate that? How do we actually see each other? And I think we might not be, we're on a journey, as you said earlier, to finding ways of realizing.
Absolutely. We're a community that has been in diaspora for 2,000 years. We have our homeland back. We have our modern state of Israel, but still we have a vibrant diaspora community. And for 2,000 years, we have been influenced by, begin to resemble physically and in other ways, the communities around that. So the fact that this is happening in the United States of America, where we're starting to resemble American society more and more over a period of time, really shouldn't come as a surprise at all. And I want to say, one way to break down barriers and establish identities is for people of color to take leadership roles in the community. And I think you're both terrific examples of this. Stacey, you're now executive director of a congregation. Isaiah, you're a rabbi, you're a public affairs advisor for Jewish federations. And so I think by maintaining the kind of visibility that you'll have, I think that's an important way to acclimate people to the reality of our changing community. And I'm just going to say one other quick note on a surprise topic, which you introduced, Stacey, and that is women's hair. Because my wife, as I mentioned, is Mizrahi, she's Persian, and I think she could write a doctoral thesis on straightening hair, and which she has an aversion to, because I have my identity. Why should I modify it to please someone else? And she has very strong sense of that, and I think there may be some of that running in the circles that you're familiar with. So I hear you on that point. I'm reminded of something that I came to understand recently about how our identity, each of us, can be defined by who else is in the room. I'm one thing, and then if I step into a room where the majority is something else, then I'm the guy who isn't like them. And I have to kind of redefine myself in a way, or reposition myself. And so that leads into what I want to talk about next. And this is a discussion, not an exam, but just fair warning, like an exam, the questions get harder as we go along. So, but it's all friendly, so it's okay. But I want to ask, how does the Jewish community fit into the larger discussion about race that's taking place in our society right now? Because we have our own history of oppression and otherness. But so does that narrative make us effective bridge builders, or is our own experience somehow less relevant at the moment because of the urgency of focusing on Black concerns right now? What do you think? Isaiah, I see you nodding in recognition.
Thank you for this question. I'll say, just personally, when thinking about Jews and whiteness, or racial identity, Jewish racial identity, it's complex. And in many ways, it's always been complex, but specifically in American Jewish life, I'll offer just one book as I'm thinking out loud, is Dr. Eric Goldstein, who wrote a book called The Price of Whiteness. And we're actually I'm in conversation with him today at 3 p.m. Eastern, for anyone who's interested. And in many ways, what we're discussing is exactly, Jewish social positioning throughout history, and knowing that the Jewish people have had a long diaspora and a long exile. Social status was something that we constantly had to negotiate for the sake of survival. So in many ways, in most countries, this meant expulsion or worse, right? If we were, based on the different variables that were impacting power and society in those countries. But in America, and also Professor Jonathan Sarna has a book about American Judaism where he speaks at depth about the different things that generated social status, right?
Yeah.
So religion was helpful for us in many ways, right? Economics is another lens. But the question around race is a really profound question. What role did race play in helping the Jewish community in America develop a social status that might protect them? Now, what we see is that, are all Jews white? No, as Stacey pointed out, and if you just Google global Jewish population, you'll see that there are Jews every color and every shade. But what we have seen is that as Jews enter into the American landscape from the 1700s, there were only 200 plus Jews in America during the 1700s. By the Civil War, there were 150,000 Jews. By the turn of the century, there were over 1.5 million. By World War II, right? So we see that there are shifting needs in the Jewish community. And so for me, like just as a frame, I think on the question of, are Jews white? How could I have white privilege if my family were second generation Holocaust survivors? Or I'm not white, I'm Jewish. I think understanding and peeling away the layers to racial identity in America and understanding American history will help people actually develop that nuance and texture that's needed. I'll say the last thing I'll share is that as a mixed race Jew who looks white, I'm very, very well aware of the fact that my internal identity does not reflect my external identity. And that when people see me, I feel like I'm the undercover brother, as I sometimes joke, right? I have front rows to things and hearing and seeing things that maybe wouldn't have been said or would be said, hopefully with more tact, if let's say Stacey was in that conversation. And what I would say is that for me, reckoning with our internal identity and the external identities that are imposed on us in society is a part of the holy work. It's messy, but it's a part of the holy work that I think we need to engage in.
Right. So it's possible to perceive yourself one way at the same time the rest of the group perceives you differently for whatever reason. And sometimes those different perspectives need to be reconciled. Stacey, what are your thoughts about this?
You know what? Thank you. So again, just like Isaiah said, thank you for this question. I find it very interesting that it comes at this time of the year. And right now, our Jewish community is really digging into and preparing for our holiest time of the year. And I think it's an opportunity to dig into our Jewish wells of strength and knowledge and find our unique contributions. So we're in the Weeks of Consolation leading up to the High Holy Days for religious and non-religious Jews. And the Midrash tells us that there's 7 weeks of consolations. And weeks 1 through 3, the divine sends messengers to comfort the people. But beginning in week 4, which is this week, the divine himself agrees to begin comforting the people directly. And so the question is, why the 3 weeks where there's just messengers and intermediaries, but the divine doesn't come until this week? And Rabbi Simon Jacobson explains it this way, that the weak mortals are sent first, and it's to teach us the power of relationships and to show us that how one vulnerable person can bring comfort to another vulnerable person. And so our Jewish history of oppression should teach us to be consolers at this moment, to console the mothers who have lost sons, to console the neighbors who are afraid to let their children walk to the store, to console the joggers who are accosted, to console the essential workers that are demeaned, all because of their skin color. And another favorite of mine is theologian Henry Nouwen, and he calls this the wounded healer. So I think it's really an opportunity for us to be essentially Jewish. Then I'm going to switch to an African-American proverb that says, in the moment of crisis, the wise build bridges and the foolish build dams. So of course, we all know that we're in a time of crisis. The first question I have is, are we prepared to be those bridge builders? Because it's a very humble job. And I was actually looking up a job description, and some of the things it said was that this person needs to be able to clean and prepare, remove debris, and
Mm.
possible hazards, load and unload, build and take apart, dig trenches, backfill, or compact the earth to prepare for construction. And so our own history should allow us to be empathetic and not easily distracted by surface arguments of, oh, who's a Jew and who's Black and who's white. But most importantly, we need to be strategic right now. We need to be in the right places, we need to be using the right tools, and we need to be having the right participants. Another thing is participating in these larger discussions on race and society and making sure that at the same time that we're digging deep and radically looking for those segments in our community where we really need to wrestle with racism in our own community.
Mm.
And then also too, having conversations on race without Jews of color in the room is not acceptable. And so again, thank you, B'nai B'rith, for making sure that we're in the room as we're having this conversation, especially when we go outside and we start to speak to the African-American community and other communities of color. I hope that Jews of color are in the room. And the last thing I'll say is that it takes a long time to build relationships, just like it does bridges. It took 8 years and thousands of men to build the Tower Bridge, the Sydney Harbor Bridge, and the Golden Gate Bridge took 4 years. And so we need to be willing to invest the time into relationship building when the cameras are not around, when it's not the news of the day. And I think that this is the time that we can do that. I was trained as a community organizer in Chicago with the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. And week after week after week, I saw these people who had been together for decades, Black and Jewish, in a room, talking and investing in those relationships so that when it was time to fight against racism or anti-Semitism, they had been investing in those relationships for decades. And so when they spoke and they gave support and strength to one another, it come from that backbreaking investment of time and effort in their relationship together with one another. And so this is the time to be building some deep, deep relationships that are going to go past this moment in this news cycle.
Excellent. I think that's going to be one of the takeaways from this conversation. We all draw our inspiration from various sources. That's just a fact of living in the modern world. But some of the answers, as you pointed out, Stacey, are in our own Jewish tradition. And so I think to be able to see these issues through a Jewish lens, drawing in part on Jewish sources, which are both very knowledgeable about, but tapping into other areas as well, I think really helps give us a fuller perspective on some of these issues. So we're living in a time where language and nomenclature play a major role in shaping social constructs. So I want to have some discussion about the way terms like white Jew and white privilege accentuate skin color. Even the term Jews of color can be problematic. I want to hear from you on this, but it can be both the source of pride and an example of otherization. In your view, do these terms pose complications, and how should we understand such phrases in the context of the current dialogue? Anyone have thoughts about those things?
Stacey, would you like to kick it off, or feel free?
I think that we should understand them within the American context. This is America, and white and Black are part of our history and how we have talked about ourselves for years. I think also we need to understand that it depends on who uses these terms, and we shouldn't be afraid to, like you're doing, ask one another, how does that make you feel?
Yeah.
And what do you want to be called? And can we have an honest conversation about what this really means? Because I could be thinking that it means one thing, and you can be thinking that it means another. And so I think when we hear it in the news, or we hear people just say the terms, we're not sure what the other person is saying, and we're reacting to what we think it means rather than really going into a dialogue. For the Jews of color, there are some people who are very comfortable with using that term, who are Jews of color, and there's some who aren't.
Mm.
So I think it's up to the person to be comfortable and understand why they're using or choosing not to use it. But I think for myself, I'm comfortable with the term Jews of color because I want to bring in both sides of my identity.
Yeah, yeah.
I am proud of both sides of my identity, and I want them to speak to one another. And I think that someone who is called a white Jew shouldn't be ashamed of that. There's no shame in that. It is just like Isaiah said, it's just a social construct. It is the percentage of melanin in your skin. What's the most important in both of these terms is Jew. That's when we can go back to who we are. What are our values? As a Jew, no matter what my color is, I have some of the same values as any other Jew. And that's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to focus on, loving our neighbor as ourself. So those terms, let's just ask each other what they mean, and then let's just be willing to put them aside and then get down to, okay, what does it mean to be a Jew at this moment and to love my neighbor no matter what?
Yeah, there's no question. In a Jewish context, the overriding point is that we're one community and we're all members of that community. So the things that distinguish us or separate us, those are details about our background, but the fact that our belongingness to this community is really the overarching point. Isaiah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say, on this note, language is really powerful. We know that language is, as people of the book, as we're sometimes called, the high holiday seasons, that machzor, those books, thousands, tens of thousands of words, the power of recognizing language and its ways of being a catalyst for both the good and the bad. We know that even in politics and in building society, language is essential. Through the utilization of language, we create power sometimes through those words. One line from King Solomon in Proverbs is maves v'chaim biyad lashon, that life and death is in the hand of speech. So the rabbis are like, what do you mean life and death? And why does my tongue have a hand? What? Like this line. So it's saying that our words are so powerful, and they lead us to action. They actually can not only trip us up, but they could lead us to feeling empowered and driven. So in terms of social power and a term like Jews of color, I think in many ways it's a helpful term, but in other ways it's not, right? In many ways it's reductive. It takes away that nuance of whether a person really identifies that way, but in other ways it's helpful because we now actually are recognizing a need for visibility and recognizing a lack of representation because we have language to be used. So for me, I think that the most important thing that I think when it comes to language is fluid, and it changes all the time based on the generation's needs, based on what's going on in every generation. How we're using language today, just exactly to Stacey's point about what we're doing right now, is we're instead of using language and as broad brushstrokes of what something is, we're having a conversation. We're exposing ourselves to these terms in hope that we're creating more nuance and in hope that we're creating more texture. And I just, going back to that line from King Solomon, our words, right? Our words have the power to create and our words have the power to destroy. And our own sensitivities, I think in many ways it's through learning, it's through immersion, and it's through really thinking for ourselves. How do I respond to this language? What is it really saying? What is it not saying? And not getting so triggered. I know it's easy to get triggered by language, but I think that there's a purpose to words. We know that our entire American democracy built off of the Mosaic Code, which is this idea that when people, it's a beautiful thing when you're watching, if you have looked at what's happening in Capitol buildings, and when we see how people are, the conversations and dialogue that take place around really, really important critical issues, just to name, reparations in America, and actually talking to the House and talking to Congress, and doing that through words. It's important. It's important that we have a command over language and recognize that it creates mobility and it does create visibility. But I also think that it's sometimes reductive. It sometimes doesn't actually paint the full picture.
Yeah, I just have a quick thought about the term white Jew, because I've always been used to being thought of or referred to as white because of my skin color. But then when I see neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville with tiki torches saying Jews, these are the self-appointed defenders of the race, and they're saying Jews will not replace us, it makes me wonder, well, how white am I? I mean, clearly they don't perceive me as one of them. And how much do I really want to fight to become part of that group, if they're, defining who's in and who's not? So, it gives me second thoughts about the term. But then I've also come to understand that the term white Jew is fraught in the sense that people of good intention, like Stacey, who said, well, it's just a way of defining, okay, you're this, I'm that, but we're all Jewish. That's kind of an easy way to understand the term. People of bad intentions, I think, can use the term white Jew both to otherize, because Jews represent the other, but also to place this person in the dominant power structure as white in a pejorative way. So you can be but it's two negative associations conflated with each other. You're the other, and you're also the dominant power structure. So either way, a shame on you, a pox on you twice. So I think maybe it's in the hands of the user how these terms can be intended and how they can be received. That's just one example of the complexity I think all these terms lead to. Speaking of complexity, Black Lives Matter. It's the most prominent civil rights movement of our time, but it poses a conundrum for us as Jews, because Jews overwhelmingly, I feel confident in saying this, support racial equality. But what do we make of the anti-Semitism that has sometimes manifested itself within the movement, like attacks on Jewish neighborhoods in Los Angeles this year, or the 2016 Movement for Black Lives platform, which was crafted by a coalition of more than 50 groups, including the Black Lives Matter Network. It declared Israel an apartheid state and endorsed BDS, boycotting of Israel. Stacey, you wrote a very thoughtful article in Tablet magazine several years ago, which I read and which I'm very happy to have the chance to ask you about. You explain in this article that you support the Black Lives Matter movement at the same time that you disagree with its anti-Israel language. So I want to know, how do you navigate that dilemma? And what do you have to tell our millennial viewers in particular, because this is in part a young professionals program, and I know we have a lot of younger people tuning in, people who want to engage in social justice causes, that because of intersectionality and other factors are often made to feel like they have to check their Zionism at the door.
This is my favorite, absolute favorite question of this whole panel. First of all, Black Lives Matter is a value statement about people. Secondly, Black Lives Matter as a movement or organization, it's, as you even said yourself, it's not monolithic, it's not one entity. There's the movement for Black Lives Matter. There's
Yes.
Black Lives Matters. There's Black Lives Matters chapters all over the country, some that are not even led by Black people. I'm just going to put that out there. But I think one of the things we have to decide is that whether we're going to deal with the value of Black people or spend our time fighting semantics or an organization. There is a room for that, and that's somewhere else. As an African American Jewish person, I have decided to focus on the value statement because it is about Black people. It's about brown bodies and Black people and their lives. There are Jewish organizations that are outright anti-Semitic and say and continue to say very divisive things within our own community. And I'm surprised at them. But we don't stop dialoguing with them because of some of the statements that we have made. We can disagree, but we stay in relationship and conversation even with those problematic Jewish organizations. So first of all, what is our relationship with Black people and the value of human life? Again, it goes back to relationships. It takes work and commitment and time outside of the news day and sound bites. We need to build relationships. And when we enter into these relationships, we need to be ready for complex conversations. That we're not looking to see whether our validity as a Jewish people are going to be diminished by getting involved with this discussion around Black Lives Matter. Are some of the things that have been said problematic and anti-Semitic? Yes. But something that I have really enjoyed learning from the Baal Shem Tov is the idea of the mochin de kadnut, the contracted or limited consciousness versus the mochin de gadlut, the expansive consciousness or thinking big. And this is where you let another's argument refine your own. I was just reading something this morning from Rabbi Erwin Kula, and he says this: when we engage in serious dialogue within ourselves and with each other, our world expands and our truths are refined, and we can incorporate the truths of others, finding new positions and even shared ethical values. So I say it is worth it. It's worth the relationship to get into these serious dialogues. We have this, again, Jewish example with Beit Hillel and Shammai. These and those are the words of the divine. Because when Beit Hillel took the other side and he explained it, and he went through that refining process, he came out with something that was even more inclusive and something that really could be grasped by all, because he wanted to make sure that he really understood the other person's position. I'll give you an example from my own training that I'm so grateful for when I was the policy director at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. What I witnessed the elders of both of my communities in dialogue together in rooms every week. And I knew that they'd been doing this for decades before I even joined the room. They were arguing. They were refining one another. They were strategizing on how to end anti-Semitism and racism. In these rooms, I saw Dr. Timuel Black, Lou Kreinberg, Reverend Dr. Calvin Lewis, Jane Ramsey, Rabbi Robert Marks, Rabbi Philip Lefkowitz, the grandson of Rosenwald, Burl Satter. She's the daughter of the civil rights lawyer, Mark Satter. I wish that every young Jewish person and every young Black person could have experienced seeing and hearing the elders and leaders from both of their communities without cameras having these deep conversations like I did. I saw them work on these relationships, like I said, for decades, and I watched their hairs turn gray. And I remember taking my children in strollers to protest marchers or conversations to hear them. I want our children to be able to see us have these conversations and not feel afraid to have them, because I got to sit at the feet of giants who were committed to long-term relationships in the fight for justice. And then the last thing I'll say is this: we have to understand where these sentiments arose from. There's an African proverb that says, a child rejected by the village will burn it down just to feel its warmth.
Mm.
And I was just talking to Isaiah the other day. Remember, we were having a conversation and you reminded me of the Talmudic story of Timnah. So I often remind people where the anti-Semitic language came from in the movement for Black Lives Matter came from Rachel Gilmer. And Rachel Gilmer is a biracial Jewish girl. And she was led to her current outlook because of feeling othered in the Jewish community.
Mm.
And so what could we have done as a village, as a Jewish village, to make her feel warmed and welcomed as a child in her own community so that she could embrace her full identity? And what are we willing to do now to engage in that relationship with the African American community and Jews of color so that we do not have another situation where one of our own children of the village is really the impetus for some of the strongest anti-Semitic statements because of how they felt in the village. We have a powerful opportunity right now to really have some dialogue, and we can't be afraid of how it might be messy, but if we're willing to have those conversations without the cameras and dig deep, I think that we will come out as better people in this conversation, because it doesn't have to, no one has to, the Jewish community doesn't have to lose or win, but we do have to have this conversation, and we do have to be willing to get messy and to really hear and understand where the other side is coming from. And I think that will be that's a very powerful opportunity and potential that we have.
Isaiah.
So beautiful, Stacey. Thank you so much for that. I would just say that, it goes back really, Eric, to the question that you asked before about language. In many ways, I find that the topic specifically of how we interact and understand our individually, our relationships to Black Lives Matter. I mean, yes, it's true that Black Lives Matter movement is the largest movement for civil rights and racial equity in American history. But also recognizing that sometimes when we feel, as Stacey was pointing out, there are many issues and things that are problematic with the charter, the movement for Black Lives. For me, it's like my question that I would ask anyone else is like, is that making you stuck? Is that preventing you from engaging in still the fight for racial equity and justice in America? For some, they would say, of course not. But for others, they actually feel stuck and not knowing how they could actually engage in this conversation, because somehow when we think of Black Lives Matter, when we think of BDS, when we think of the Nation of Islam, when we think of what some people are calling Black anti-Semitism versus just anti-Semitism, right? This language that we're experiencing, people feel stuck. So the first thing I would say is very much to recognize that there are channels for us to engage in this work that might fit more comfortably. And the question I would ask is, are you spending more time? What's your ratio? Are you spending more time throwing shade at Black Lives Matter movement than you are finding channels to engage in racial equity and justice? That's the first thing. And then really just to piggyback and reiterate what Stacey shared, a friend of mine, someone who I have been hanging out with for the last 2 years, is the chair for New York Black Lives Matter. Him and I have been getting coffee and lunch together until the pandemic. I was literally with him for lunch in February or in January at a kosher certified restaurant right down the street from the OU in the financial district of New York City. Him and I, he wears the same outfit every day, pants or slacks, and a shirt that says Black Lives Matter on it. This man, Hawk Newsom, is 6'5", a tall Black man, and him and I, we would have lunch together before anything that was going on. And what would we talk about? We would talk about God. He went to Touro Law School. We would talk about spirituality, Judaism, the Bible. We would talk about our common ancestry of sharing ancestors who were slaves in America. We would talk about who we were and what brought us together. When everything started erupting, I'm texting him, and I'm like, yo, like, you just posted that thing about X, like, can we talk about that? Like, And I'm like, dude, can we talk? He's like, oh my gosh. And we talk on the phone. He's like, you know, so there's a relationship is my point. And the relationship is rooted in just as what Stacey shared. It's rooted in a common goal to dismantle racism in America, but it's also rooted in our values and what we believe and what we want to see in the world. So I want to encourage us to find those channels if we don't have those relationships, best practices for how to build relationships during a time of chaos that's reactive. That's something else to talk about. Not necessarily Stacey's like, no, and I'm like, yeah, not necessarily the easiest or the best ways to engage in building relationships, but still nonetheless important for us to find ways in which we could build those relationships. So it's not simple, and I don't think we'll solve it today, but I do think that we still need to find our channels for engagement, and also through relationship building, I think we peel away layers that help us develop nuance and ways that we could find a way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think this business of identifying shared values and common goals, which is key to relationship building, that's a way to get beyond, I think, some of the peripheral issues about, well, do I agree with them on this? Or do they agree, you know, did they offend me on this point? Because if you start with, for example, we support racial justice and racial equality, full stop, period. That's a good place to start. And that way, I mean, frankly, I represent B'nai B'rith. It's a large Jewish organization. There are institutional questions that need to be faced, like, do we put this hashtag on our Twitter, or, you know, can we put this on our website, because you have to, you know, vet these things. And those can be, you know, there's a real questions to be addressed. But if you start with, these are our principles, and we're clear on that, I think it's a good starting off point. And well, as always, we could go on for hours, but we're getting close to the end of our time. I wanted to ask a quick out question, if I may. It's been weighing on my mind, because this goes into history a little bit, and we're coming up on this anniversary of the August 28th, Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, and the march this week is going to be hosted by Al Sharpton, who's a different kind of character than Martin Luther King was. But my question goes to Martin Luther King, because we always look for role models in our Jewish tradition and in American history. But sometimes there's a risk that some icons can be misappropriated for rhetorical or political gain, or that our view of them simply changes over time. And so Martin Luther King is of particular interest here, because often he seems like a cure for what ails us nowadays. His marching for civil rights alongside Rabbi Heschel, his support for Israel at its great hour of need during the 1967 war. We worry about what other communities feel about Israel today. He was very avowedly pro-Israel. And his description of a dream deeply rooted in the American dream, to which we're all stakeholders, and the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note that falls upon all of us as Americans to fulfill. These are things that resonate with all of us. They inspire all of us. So can King's legacy still play an important role in energizing the Black-Jewish relationship today? You're being contemplative about that. Stacey, what do you think?
I definitely think it is. I think there's none of us in either community that does not respect the hard work that Dr. Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel and many others put into the movement. They definitely left a blueprint for us. I think that it's time for us to not be afraid to be innovative and set our own path. We have to understand that he was a religious man, and his message was very prophetic. And at that time, the African American community was deeply religious, and maybe even our own Jewish community was a bit more religious. And though the motifs and the language was really understood, and there was a shared common language. Both of our communities are much more secular
Mm.
today, and I think that how we talk about social justice, how we talk about economic justice, how we talk about um, community, we have our own language, and our generation is starting to grapple with its own way of coalescing the ideas and the language. And so it is a wonderful um, history that we have to build upon, but I don't think we have to be wedded to that language, because it's different, and we're a different generation. We do have common language and common goals around social justice and about the dignity of human life that we can come together on. And so I think that we can't be afraid to be our own generation and stand up and have our own voices and our own
Yep,
language.
absolutely. Isaiah.
Yeah, I think of the opening line to the prayer book that some say every morning, Moda ani lefanecha, right? This idea
Yep.
that we say, Moda ani, I am grateful lefanecha. And I think these three words, just even to start, the ani, it's about me and my context, my lane, who I am. And when it comes to any social issue, we need to understand who we are and our lane and how we could engage in this work. But then the question of lefanecha, right? What's in front of you? As we start our day, recognizing hopefully that there's something beyond us that we could connect to, something greater than myself or the ani. But at the same time, how I engage with lefanecha does depend on the ani, how I engage with the world, right? Whether I march or I don't march, whether I engage or I don't engage. Specifically to our leaders, our ancestors who sent us, right? And in many ways, I feel sent by my ancestors. My middle name being Joseph. Joseph says to his brothers, when his brothers come down suffering, he says, "L'michya shalachni Elokim lifneichem." God sent me here for you. And in many ways, I would say that in the legacies of the great civil rights leaders of the 20th century, yes, we do have a blueprint as has been shared.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think that we are living in many ways without a sense of leadership that's clear, that's prophetic, that offers something that's rooted in spirituality and humanity and human rights, the way that Stacey was capturing before. For me, I would just like the thought that I just started with, which about the lifanecha and the ani. I feel like it's important to remember that we're really complex as humans. We're very complex beings. And every single day, we have to reorient ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, who is the ani? What is my lane? From where I'm seated as an institution, from where I'm seated as an individual, what are the strengths that I could bring to the lifanecha? What are the things that I could bring to the greater sphere? And if it's marching, great. And if it's not marching, then let's figure it out. Let's find those things that make the ani shine with the lifanecha, is what I would offer.
Excellent. Well, once again, we could go on for hours on these subjects. Unfortunately, we're at the end of the 1 hour that's been allotted for this discussion. But Stacey Aviva Flint, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, you both been tremendous. I really enjoyed this discussion, and you're two of my favorite thought leaders now on race and identity in the Jewish community. And I want to thank you both, not just for joining us today and enlivening this discussion with your candid insights, but for being bridge builders within and outside our community. You've reminded us of what Martin Luther King referred to as the inescapable network of mutuality, the need to promote justice everywhere, which is our ongoing task. And I just, sometimes it's nice to do a little summation at the end. Among the things we've learned today are the importance of education, relationship building, and understanding others and understanding ourselves, the lane that we're in, where we sit in this environment, as you say, Isaiah. And so these are all takeaways as we move forward and continue this work. And finally, I'd like to thank all of our viewers for watching today. Please stay tuned for announcements about future B'nai B'rith International and B'nai B'rith Connect programs, or check out our website at b'naibrith.org to find out more about our organization's work. Have a good day and stay safe, everyone.